And now we're going to move on to Dr. Nancy Gassman, who is the Fort Lauderdale Assistant Public Works Director. Some probably very interesting slides about how climate change could impact Fort Lauderdale. Dr. Gassman.
Good morning. We've been feeding your minds all morning, and I'm between you and feeding your stomachs. So a quick picture of the city of Fort Lauderdale, and while Mecklenburg is now 87% built out, we're beyond 100%. We're somewhere 157% because we are now building up. Fort Lauderdale is, I don't have my slides in front of me. Fort Lauderdale is about 40 square miles. It has 182,000 residents, but we have over 13 million visitors every year in the greater Fort Lauderdale area. And we have a just property value of close to $50 billion. And so the property value is a very important part of any community, primarily because it helps pay to run the government and provide the services that are so important to our neighbors. And the city decided a few years back that it wants to be the place you never want to leave. It wants to be a city where people live, grow, and stay for a long period of time. And since this is a workshop on resilience, I wanted to remind you that resilience isn't about sea level rise. It's not about rainstorms. It's about economic resilience. It's about leadership and strategy. It's about health and well-being. And these are all the things that the Rockefeller City Resilience Index talks about. It's not just the infrastructure piece. It is the piece of how you absorb these shocks and stresses, as Colonel Dodd mentioned this morning. And we have a number of interesting ones in the city. We have tropical storms, which you experience as well. We are seeing a number of extreme rain events. For most places in the country, a 3-inch rain is a devastating rain. Well, that's our system is built for stormwater to hit a 3-inch rain. 3-inch rain, we can keep the streets dry. Beyond that, we struggle. And so we're seeing a lot more rainfall that exceeds that 3 inches in a 24-hour period. What are some of our chronic stressors? Well, the city is 108 years old, and so we have challenges with our infrastructure. We have challenges with traffic, tidal flooding and extreme rainfall, as mentioned, sea level rise. Our expectation, based on the South Florida Regional Climate Compact, the expectation is to see somewhere between 14 and 26 inches of sea level rise from a baseline of 1992 by the year 2060. And for a very, very flat, we like to call ourselves topographically challenged area, that's a lot of additional sea level rise to deal with. Oh, and of course for you, one of the things that you can consider as a potential chronic stressor for you is algal blooms, and we are also starting to experience that in the city of Fort Lauderdale, but at a very, very different scale. The city is called the Venice of America because we have 165 miles of waterway. And so water is very, very much a part of our culture. And when we look at the predictions for sea level rise moving forward, recognizing that we have to plan for the future, and I appreciated Colonel Dodd's thought that the Army Corps folks that were planning in 1919 had to think out 100 years. They could not have imagined where we are today. And it's one of the things that we have to do as planners is think out what are our potential futures. No one has a perfect crystal ball, but we've got to think about the future. If we look at the fact that we've received about 3 to 4 inches of that sea level rise to date from that 1992 baseline, if we look at NOAA's most extreme prediction for the future, and again, there's a range of values, this is what our downtown area will look like, and I'll toggle back for you. This is what it looks like today. This is what it will look like in the future if the most extreme predictions come true. And the importance of that is that this is not the definite future. This is a potential future. And so we need to take action now in order to address these concerns so that this is not the future of the city of Fort Lauderdale. But we're also seeing those impacts from sea level rise now. We have extreme tidal flooding that's impacting our neighborhoods. It's impacting our historical and cultural amenities, and it's impacting our educational and recreational facilities as well. So this is tidal flooding. And the expectation is that currently in Fort Lauderdale we get 2 high tides per day. Currently we're experiencing somewhere a little bit north of 10 of these types of events annually. But the expectation is that by the year 2045, we're going to see about 240 of these types of nuisance flooding events based on the elevation of the city. So it's something that we absolutely have to address and deal with. And the city, about 5 years ago, got the community together and had a number of workshops and a variety of different tools to get input, which created the Fast Forward Fort Lauderdale Vision for 2035. And one of the things that was in that vision that was translated into our Press Play 5-year strategic plan was the idea that we want to be a sustainable and resilient community. And one of the things that I'll focus in on as part of that is this idea that we want to reduce flooding and adapt to sea level rise. That's just one of the pieces. And so the city, starting with that vision and moving into its strategic plan, has created a culture of resiliency around that goal and around that objective. We do an annual neighbor survey similar to Mecklenburg County. We actually use the same vendor. And we ask our neighbors, have you seen the impacts of increasing sea level? Are you noticing that there's more flooding? What's your perception of what's happening in our environment? And they tell us, yes, we see it. And yes, we want you to invest in it and make things better. When they're concerned about traffic, part of that traffic concern is that certain roadways are flooded regularly and they don't have good access. Every year, our commission sits down and they try to pick out 5 to 10 things that they want to focus on in that year. Every year for the last few years, stormwater has been one of the things they want to focus on, and last year they decided that for this year they want us to focus on algal blooms as things of concern. All of that information gets translated into our adopted budget. The things that are more important to the commission, they get funded with a little more money. We're allowed to do budget amendments. And that also translates into our 5-year capital improvement plan. And so there is a policy mechanism, a focus mechanism that starts with that long-term vision, works down into the community, works back through the elected officials, that translates into the funding to do the things that are important to the community. So Barbara talked a little bit about comprehensive planning. We just did our evaluation and appraisal report 2 years ago, and we said the thing that's missing in our comprehensive plan is policies that recognize both the peril of flood, but also how do we deal with climate change in general and its impact to our city. And so there's going to be a dedicated climate element in our comprehensive plan that we're working on right now, but we're also putting all of that information about those concerns into the other elements, and so it all integrates together. We're also developing a design and construction manual that will inform our internal engineers about how they should be building our public infrastructure in a sustainable and resilient way, but it also will inform our developers about how their buildings interface into the public realm and the things that they need to do in order to come up to this ideal of a sustainable and resilient community. In the last 5 years, we've updated every one of our infrastructure master plans, and every one of them starts on the foundation of the projections of sea level rise for our future, which were adopted by resolution by our commission. And so our seawall master plan, our stormwater master plan, our comprehensive utility master plan for both water and wastewater, our parks plan, and most recently our cemetery plan all take into consideration that concern about rising seas. All of this feeds into our investments in resiliency in our capital improvement plan, which we call our community investment plan. So Whitney showed you, the very talented and lovely Whitney showed you her animation of what happens, and this really reflects that, is that when we see these higher tides, the water runs up into our storm drain system. It comes out of the storm drain. And the idea behind modern construction of stormwater, and I'll apologize to the stormwater engineers, is that your finished floor should be higher than the crown of the road. And so what happens is that the roadway becomes part of the capacity to deal with a stormwater event. And so the roads flood when we have a really, really strong rainstorm, but your house doesn't. But what we were starting to see is that it could be a beautiful sunny day and our roads were flooding. And so in a situation where you're dealing with problems that no one's really experienced before, you have to figure out how to deal with the technologies that are available and the emerging technologies. And so what the city did is they started to invest in what are called tidal valves, one-way valves, check valves. But these go into the storm drain pipe, and during a high tide, they don't allow the flow of water to come up and through the storm drains. They hold it back. But as Whitney pointed out, if it rains during an extreme high tide, there is nowhere for the water to go because those valves can't open as long as there's water behind them. And so in the areas that you see, this is a particular neighborhood, the Los Olas Isles area in the city of Fort Lauderdale. Those areas that you see as orange on the slide, those are areas that when you map out the vulnerability of those neighborhoods, a 2-foot sea level rise would cause permanent inundation in those areas. And again, it looks like a road grid. Why? Because the roads are built lower than the houses, so the houses don't flood, the roads flood first. And what you can see with all of those little dots, all of those colored dots, is that's where we have started to install the tidal valves. And so the predictive nature of the elevations tell us where the tidal valves need to go, and it's where we see the flooding. And so we've started to install, at this point, 162 of these tidal valves throughout our city. And you're saying, well, do they really work? So this is an extreme high tide that we saw in September of 2015. That green arrow is there for reference. That's not a particularly important construction barrel. It's just for reference. And so we had this extreme high tide, the road flooded. At low tide, we ran in, installed the tidal valve. This is the next day at that same extreme high tide. And you can see that the street is dry. So this type of technology can be very effective when used in the right place for the right reasons. But tidal flooding was not just happening through our storm drain system, it was coming up and over our seawalls. As I mentioned, we have 165 miles of waterway. Almost all of them are seawalled because they were, in many cases, artificially created. And so we have a lot of seawalls in the city. And what was happening in this situation was it was the rainwater, the high tide was not only coming up through the storm drain system, and it didn't matter if there was a tidal valve in it or not, because it was coming up over the seawalls and it was flooding the roadways coming up over the seawalls. And so the city's solution to that was to develop an ordinance which requires that all new seawalls have to be built to a certain height. And when we went out to the community, and I personally did the 23 public outreach events over a 6-week period because they were excited about this proposal. The original proposal said everybody in the city had to raise their seawall by the year 2035. Where we ended up with was that if you build a new one, you have to come up to the new standard. But if your seawall is causing a problem in a neighborhood, in other words, if your seawall is low and the tide's coming over and it's flooding the entire neighborhood, you are creating a public nuisance and you have to raise your seawall. And so the only neighborhoods and the only individuals who have to raise their seawalls are those that are at a level which is causing a problem. And that allows us to adapt over time and not create a massive burden on the public. It only creates a burden in the areas where your seawall is so low that it's causing a public nuisance to others. So we were talking a little bit about designated adaptation action area. This is a authorized by state statute, and we have policies on our coastal zone management plan that allow us to designate adaptation action areas. And the way that we do it, the way that we designate in the city of Fort Lauderdale is that we have a dedicated chapter in the capital improvement plan that says these are the areas where we see coastal flooding or flooding from extreme rain events in our area, and that this is the city's commitment to invest dollars in your neighborhood to reduce your vulnerability to these flooding events. And so there are 17 areas designated at this time, and there are 42 capital improvement projects that the city intends to invest in over the next 5 years. But we also recognize that we need to be partners in resiliency. What this graphic is it's a small portion of our downtown area, and each of those lines represents a different, it represents the storm drain system, and you'll notice that there are different colors. Each color represents a different jurisdiction. So the city of Fort Lauderdale can do everything possible to protect its stormwater system, but if we don't engage the county and we don't engage the state to also fix their challenges in their stormwater system, we will not solve our problems. And so it's very important that you have partnerships in terms of the jurisdictions that coexist with you in your different municipalities. It's also important to engage regional entities, your own community activists, your HOAs, as well as your economic resilience. We are very involved with our chamber talking about economic resilience and how sea level rise is going to have an impact on our economic resilience and what can we do about that. And also if you have local universities and colleges that are interested in this topic, it's very important to engage them as well. Florida has a Florida Climate Institute, which is a collaboration from a number of different universities in the area. They are putting out amazing academic research on these topics, and you try to engage them because they can do work that you can't do from your own standpoint. So I've talked a lot about sea level rise, but I want to shift gears and talk about some of the other potential impacts that we are seeing through the National Climate Assessment and others. Basically, it's not just about sea level rise. For City of Fort Lauderdale, as the Venice of America, it is, but we also recognize there's other types of impacts. Historically, in Florida, what you see there is that from 1971 until 2000, we had roughly between 0 and 15 days where we would go higher than 95 degrees. It's one of the amazing things about living in Florida is that it doesn't get super hot. It's just, oh yeah, it's the humidity. It's a dry heat. No, it's not. But the projection going forward from roughly the year 2040 onward is that we're going to start to see more and more of these 95-degree days, and the number there is 75 days is the prediction. And so we're going to become a different community. There's more U.S. downpours that are more than 3 inches. So since 1950, we've gone up 20% in terms of the number of 3-inch downpours that we see on average. So it's raining more, it's raining harder. The planting zones have started to move northward. If you couldn't plant a palm tree in your yard before, you can now. It's very exciting. However, we're also seeing more extremes on the other end, which means sometimes it gets a lot colder than it's ever been. And so that palm tree in your front yard is great, and as it grows, and then we have a very unusual frost and you lose the tree because it can't deal with frost. And so we're seeing a lot of new plant species that can live in the area. They're viable now, including exotics, but there's also this other aspect of if it gets a lot colder, even for a short period of time, you end up losing those species. The ticks are on the march. So this is a graphic from Climate Central that shows if you look at Florida in the year 2005, we were included in the Lyme disease tick locations. But if you look out to 2080, those ticks are going to move northward, possibly to Mecklenburg. And we will be seeing less of those. However, that also means that there's other types of wildlife that is migrating northward. And when you think about a nature preserve, let's say the Everglades, the species that currently can live in the Everglades will have to migrate northward, but the boundaries of that park will not migrate with them. And so these are challenges that we have to start thinking about now. And the types of species that you're used to seeing are changing. And the timing of those species. A great example is that the cherry blossoms in Washington have been, every decade, they've been coming in a day earlier. And so now, over the course of the last number of decades, they're now coming in a week earlier. Think about how you plan your tourism. Think about how you plan your events. And these things are now changing because of the temperature and because of the timing of how wildlife is migrating and where they're going. And this also creates real health concerns because in this example, Lyme disease may be a thing of the past in this area, but there are other diseases that are coming up from the tropics that couldn't survive here in the past, and now they're here. And algal blooms. With more extreme rainfall, you tend to push more nutrients into the waterways. When the water is warmer, the algae is happier. And so in the city of Fort Lauderdale, we are seeing more and more of these algal blooms that are occurring, and they are increasing in intensity. They're showing up earlier in the year because the water is warmer, and again, because of these more extreme rainfall events. And so this is another issue that we see as an emerging concern, and as I noted earlier, our public officials have said one of their priorities this year is to start trying to address how can we prevent algal blooms. Whitney already talked to you a little bit about investing in resiliency and the value of that. The number I've got here is 6-to-1. It's the same chart. But investing in resiliency is really about preserving your credit rating. She talked a little bit about the Moody's bond rating, and I can tell you we went out for a water and sewer bond about 2 years ago now, and they absolutely asked us, what are you doing about climate change? How are you planning for sea level rise? Because they want to know that the investment that they're about to make in this bond, you will be a viable community moving forward in order to pay it back. It's very important to preserve your neighborhoods. That is your tax base. The more you have to address resiliency, the more money you potentially need to address resiliency, and if you don't have the tax base, a lowering tax base is not going to support an increasing effort in resiliency. So sustaining those property values. How do you fund resiliency? So in the city, we have done a number of revenue bonds. We are currently looking to do a $200 million revenue bond for stormwater. That's completely supported by utility fees. There's special revenue funds, putting in impact fees, grant funding, please see Barbara and Whitney. Energy service contracts is a way to fund some of the mitigation side of these issues. How do you reduce your operation and maintenance costs? But there's also general obligation bonds. In Fort Lauderdale, we just voted in $150 million to improve our park system. About 10 years ago, Broward County did a $400 million bond to protect the park systems. That is paid for on your property tax bill, even though it's not part of your millage rate. But millage rate is also another opportunity to increase your coffers so that you can address and invest in resiliency, special assessments, private investments, and P3s, which is public-private partnerships. And there's lots of tools out there to build resilience. This is another guide from the Rockefeller group that tells you that in order to build for resiliency, you need to understand your vulnerabilities. Every community will be different. You need to make sure that you have a stable economy, stable jobs. You need to deal with your community with equity. Design with your natural systems. Maximize the co-benefits when you put in some type of infrastructure. And pay attention to innovation and technology, because it is an emerging problem that we are dealing with. And while Whitney said there's some solutions, when I started in this process 10 years ago, nobody was talking about it, and we were building all of this from the ground up. You have the benefit in this community of 10 years of other communities creating a foundation for you. And so you're very lucky to start at this point so that you already have the lessons learned from others to move forward. And with that, I will stop, and thank you for your time, and enjoy your lunch.